The Taiwan Strait swallowed sound differently than open ocean. It carried voices further across black water, carried the concussion of exploding steel through the hulls of ships still afloat, carried the screams of burned men clinging to wreckage that had, 20 minutes earlier, been a merchant convoy running supplies to a dying empire. And somewhere beneath that churning surface, in a shattered length of pressurized steel resting nose up on the seafloor, a small number of American sailors were breathing air that would not last until morning. 10 months later, sitting aboard a rescue ship in Tokyo Bay, the man who had commanded that submarine gave a story to a war correspondent from the Associated Press. He said the explosion had come from nowhere. He said the stern had simply vanished in a wall of fire and noise. And he said, in words that would be printed in newspapers across the United States before the true account was ever told, that there was a terrible explosion and our stern was blown off. I never knew what hit us. It must have been a mine. It was a very heavy blast and it broke the backs of many of my crew. It was not a mine. Richard O'Kane knew exactly what had hit the Tang because he had ordered it fired himself and he had watched it happen. The single most successful American submarine of the Second World War, a vessel that in less than 13 months of combat service sank more enemy tonnage than any other boat in the United States Navy, was destroyed by her own final torpedo. A weapon that left her own bow tube, ran a wide circle through the black water of the strait, and returned to strike the hull that had launched it. This is the story of how the Tang became a legend, and how the same machine of war that made her legendary consumed her whole. To understand how impossible that ending seemed to the men who lived through it, one has to understand what the Tang had become by the autumn of 1944. She was not simply an effective submarine. She was, by any accounting the Navy would eventually accept, the deadliest one the United States ever sent to sea. Over 5 war patrols spanning barely a year, she was later credited with sinking 33 enemy ships, totaling 116,454 tons, placing her first among American submarines in both ships and tonnage destroyed. The submarine that came closest, the Flasher, sank over 16,000 tons less. 23 other boats in the fleet, many of which conducted far more patrols and spent far more months at sea, never came close to matching her total. The men she hunted did not initially believe the numbers when reports filtered up through Imperial Japanese Navy escort commands. Convoys that had crossed the Taiwan Strait for years without serious incident were suddenly being gutted in a single night. Ships sunk in rapid succession by an enemy that surfaced boldly among them, fired torpedoes from impossibly close range, and vanished before escorts could bring their guns to bear. Japanese naval officers accustomed to the caution of earlier American submarine doctrine now faced something else entirely. A captain willing to run on the surface, inside the formation, trading the safety of depth for the accuracy of point-blank range. That was not the war Imperial Japanese escort crews had trained to fight. And by the autumn of 1944, fear of the American submarine threat in that corridor between Formosa and the Chinese mainland had become a matter of open concern within Japanese merchant marine and naval circles, who depended on that strait to move fuel, troops, and raw materials to a home island's economy being slowly strangled by exactly this kind of underwater interdiction. None of it happened by accident, and none of it happened without the industrial machine behind it. The story of the Tang begins not in the Taiwan Strait, but in California, at the Mare Island Navy Yard, where the contract for her construction was awarded in the closing weeks of 1941. In the same window of catastrophe and mobilization that followed the attack on Pearl Harbor, she was laid down as a Balao-class submarine, part of a design lineage that refined the already formidable Gato-class boats that preceded it, chiefly by thickening the pressure hull and pushing her safe operating depth deeper than any American submarine class before it. She was launched in the summer of 1943 and formally delivered to the Navy that November, commissioned under the command of Lieutenant Commander Richard Hetherington O'Kane, a 1934 graduate of the Naval Academy who had already served as executive officer aboard the submarine Wahoo under the aggressive, controversial command of Dudley Walker Morton, one of the most successful and most tactically radical submarine skippers of the early Pacific War. That apprenticeship mattered enormously. Morton had pioneered an approach to submarine combat that broke sharply from pre-war American doctrine, which emphasized submerged approaches, conservative torpedo expenditure, and withdrawal at the first sign of danger. Morton believed instead in aggression, in surface attacks at night when a submarine's low silhouette made her nearly invisible against dark water, in pressing an attack until the last usable torpedo was gone, and in accepting far greater tactical risk in exchange for far greater results. O'Kane absorbed that philosophy completely, and when he assumed his own command, he carried it into every patrol the Tang would ever run. The submarine herself was a masterwork of American industrial standardization, built to specifications that prioritized parts interchangeability and rapid production every bit as much as raw performance. She measured just over 300 feet in length and displaced roughly 1,500 tons on the surface, powered by 4 diesel engines that could push her north of 20 knots surfaced, dropping to a slower, silent crawl on electric battery power once submerged. She carried 10 torpedo tubes, 6 forward and 4 aft, and could load 24 torpedoes total for a single patrol, a war load that O'Kane would come to know intimately, because emptying that load completely, firing every single torpedo aboard before turning for home, became something close to a personal standard for him. American submarine production during the war was itself a study in the industrial dominance that would define so much of the Pacific Campaign, where Japanese submarine construction remained comparatively small in scale and often diverted towards specialized, exotic designs. American shipyards turned out Gatto and Balao-class boats in a standardized, repeatable process that let the Navy field a fleet of roughly 288 submarines over the course of the war, each one built to common tolerances, common torpedo tube dimensions, and common systems that made crew training, spare parts logistics, and battle damage repair dramatically more efficient than anything the Imperial Japanese Navy could sustain. The Tang was one product of that system, but what she did with the tools that system gave her depended entirely on the men who sailed her, and increasingly, on a piece of ordnance that the same industrial machine had built badly. That flaw takes us into the heart of the story, because the tragedy of the Tang cannot be understood without understanding the tortured, humiliating history of the American submarine torpedo in the first half of the Pacific War. The primary weapon carried in the Tang's forward tubes for most of her career was the Mark 14 torpedo, a steam-driven weapon whose magnetic exploder, the Mark 6, was designed to detonate beneath a target's keel using the ship's own magnetic field, delivering a far more destructive blow than a simple contact hit against the side of the hull. On paper, it was an elegant solution. In practice, it was a catastrophe that took the Navy nearly 2 years of war to properly diagnose and fix. Submarine crews across the Pacific Fleet spent 1942 and much of 1943 firing torpedoes that ran erratically deep, passing harmlessly beneath targets they should have destroyed, or that struck their targets squarely and simply failed to explode at all, the firing pin crumpling uselessly against armor plate. Bureau of Ordnance officials in Washington, defensive about a weapon they had spent years and considerable sums developing, were slow to accept that the fault lay with the torpedo rather than with the crews firing it. And it took the stubborn, methodical testing of submarine skippers in the field, men who fire torpedoes at cliff faces and empty netting simply to measure their actual running depth and detonation behavior, to finally force Washington to admit that the depth-keeping mechanism ran roughly 10 feet deeper than set, that the magnetic exploder detonated prematurely or not at all, depending on latitude and local magnetic conditions, and that even the backup contact exploder often failed on a squarely delivered hit because the firing pin mechanism jammed under the shock of impact. It was not until 1943 that fixes to these compounding failures were fully implemented fleet-wide, and by then, an entire generation of submarine crews had watched perfectly executed attacks against enemy shipping produce nothing but a wake of bubbles and a wounded, escaping target. By the time the Tang entered combat in early 1944, many of those problems had been corrected, and O'Kane's extraordinary run of sinkings across his first 4 patrols reflected a torpedo finally living up to its intended lethality. But the Navy had also introduced a newer weapon into the mix, the Mark 18 torpedo, an electric-powered design adapted directly from a captured German pattern. The Mark 18 ran slower than the steam-driven Mark 14, but it left no visible wake, no telltale trail of bubbles rising to the surface that could betray a submarine's firing position to an alert lookout. For a captain like O'Kane, who prized aggressive, close-range surface attacks above almost anything else in submarine warfare, a wakeless torpedo was an obvious tactical advantage, and the Tang carried a mixed loadout of both types into her fifth and final patrol. The Mark 18, however, carried a defect of its own, one far more dangerous to the firing vessel than anything the Mark 14 had ever done. Its steering mechanism, if damaged or malfunctioning at launch, could cause the torpedo to fail to run straight, curving instead to a wide arc that, under the wrong circumstances, could bring it back around toward the very submarine that had fired it. It was a known risk within the submarine force, though a rare one, and one that had already claimed an American submarine earlier in the war. Malfunctioning torpedoes plagued the Navy throughout much of World War II, and on March 26, 1944, while on her fourth war patrol off Palau, the submarine Tullibee became the first American submarine in World War II to be sunk by one of her own torpedoes. And of her 80-man crew, only one survived. The Tang's crew almost certainly knew that story. None of them expected to relive it. By late September of 1944, the Tang had already built the reputation that would define her. By September 24th, 1944, when the Tang left Pearl Harbor on her fifth patrol, with 87 men aboard, she had already sunk 17 Japanese ships and rescued 22 downed United States airmen. That last detail mattered as much to the crew's sense of identity as any combat statistic. During carrier air raids on the Japanese fleet anchorage at Truk earlier that year, the Tang had taken up lifeguard station off the atoll, recovering aviators who had been shot down or forced to ditch during the strikes, hauling them dripping and shaking out of open water while enemy shore batteries and aircraft remained a very real threat. It was dangerous, patient work, utterly different in rhythm from a torpedo attack, and it gave the Tang's crew a dual reputation within the fleet, as hunters and as rescuers both. The fifth patrol carried her back into the waters she knew best, the Taiwan Strait, that narrow, shallow, heavily trafficked corridor between the Chinese mainland and Japanese-held Formosa, through which so much of the empire's remaining seaborne supply had to pass. O'Kane was offered the chance to sail as part of a coordinated wolf pack alongside 3 other submarines. He declined, choosing instead to hunt alone, trusting his own instincts and his crew's proven skill over the coordination overhead of a multi-boat formation. It was a decision entirely consistent with the aggressive, individualistic style Morton had modeled for him years earlier aboard the Wahoo. The patrol opened with immediate success. Early sinkings in the first days at sea confirmed that the strait remained as rich with targets as ever. And by the third week of October, the Tang was tracking one of the largest convoys she had yet encountered, a formation the crew's plotting team cataloged as convoy designation U-03, comprising 6 vessels including 2 armed escorts, the Chuga and the Hasu. What followed on the night of October 22nd into the early hours of October 23rd was among the most ferocious single actions any American submarine fought during the entire war. O'Kane drove the Tang directly into the heart of the formation on the surface, firing torpedoes in nearly every direction as escorts and merchant ships alike scrambled in confusion around her. 2 Japanese vessels, attempting to maneuver against the submarine, ended up colliding with one another in the chaos, a detail later confirmed by survivors and by the sheer implausibility of an American submarine causing that kind of self-inflicted damage to an enemy formation simply through aggressive positioning. By the close of that engagement, the convoy had been effectively destroyed as a fighting or transporting unit, its remaining vessels scattered, burning, or sunk outright. It was, by any measure, one of the single most productive nights of the entire Pacific submarine campaign, and it pushed the Tang's cumulative total for the patrol, and for her career, into rarefied territory. But it also emptied her magazine. By the early morning hours of October 25th, After 5 patrols and dozens of torpedoes expended against convoy after convoy, the Tang had exactly 2 torpedoes left in her tubes, both intended to finish off a heavily damaged transport that O'Kane's crew had already wounded but not yet sent to the bottom. What happened next has been reconstructed from the accounts of the 9 men who survived it. Cross-referenced against the official War Patrol report, O'Kane eventually filed once the war ended and the true story could finally be told. O'Kane had 2 torpedoes remaining to finish off a wounded transport and fired both in succession around 2:30 in the morning on October 25th. While the first ran straight, the second curved to the left and came back around on the Tang, and unable to maneuver away, the Tang was hit by her own torpedo and went down in 180 feet of water. Some accounts place the point of impact near the stern. Others describe the explosion tearing through the after torpedo room directly. Regardless of the precise location, the effect was immediate and catastrophic. Crewmen below decks felt the deck buckle, and the after section of the boat effectively ceased to exist as a survivable space in the span of a heartbeat. Lieutenant Lawrence Savadkin, who had joined the Tang for this final patrol and was standing watch in the conning tower when the torpedo struck, later gave one of the only first-hand descriptions of the moment as it was actually experienced, rather than the cover story O'Kane initially offered to the press. "We were surface trailing a convoy in shallow water," Savadkin said. "I was in the conning tower when the torpedo hit. It was like the world coming to an end." He would go on to describe, in the same account, feeling his way through darkness and flooding water to an open hatch, finding an air pocket that helped carry him to the surface, and swimming what he estimated as roughly 100 feet through open water in the dark before finally breaking into the night air above the wreck. The submarine did not disintegrate outright. What remained of her intact structure settled onto the seabed roughly 180 feet below the surface. Her bow section still largely watertight even as her stern lay shattered and flooded behind her. That distinction between the destroyed after section and the still survivable forward compartments would determine who lived and who did not over the desperate hours that followed. O'Kane himself was thrown clear of the conning tower by the force of the blast and found himself in open water almost immediately, along with a handful of others who had been on the bridge or in the tower at the moment of impact. Inside the hull, the men who survived the initial explosion faced an entirely different fight. Those trapped in the forward torpedo room, cut off from the surface by 180 feet of black water and a hull increasingly filling with seawater, chlorine gas from damaged batteries, and diminishing breathable air, had to make a decision that submarine crews trained for constantly but almost never actually had to execute under real combat conditions: whether and how to attempt an escape using the Momsen lung, a small rebreather apparatus designed for exactly this kind of emergency-free ascent. Survivors still inside the submarine, including O'Kane, made their way to the undamaged bow compartments, destroyed any sensitive documents on board, and began to escape. 13 attempted the escape, but only 8 reached the surface. The mathematics of that single sentence: 5 men lost in transit between a flooding hull and the open sky 180 feet above them, tells you everything about how narrow the margin for survival truly was that night. Above the wreck, the men who had escaped through the conning tower or been thrown into the water by the blast faced a different kind of ordeal. One measured not in minutes of held breath, but in hours of exposure in open, current-driven water, in a strait patrolled by an enemy whose ships they had just spent 2 nights sinking. 4 of the survivors, including O'Kane, spent the rest of the night, roughly 8 hours, treading water in the dark strait, with no way of knowing whether rescue would come from a friendly source or an enemy one, or whether it would come at all. Cold, exhaustion, and the current worked against them continuously. Some who had escaped the sinking hull, whether through the conning tower or through the desperate free ascent from the forward torpedo room, did not survive long enough to be pulled from the water at all. Of the men who managed to get clear of the wreck by any means, several succumbed to their injuries or to sheer exhaustion before any rescue vessel arrived, a detail that makes the final survivor count even more sobering than the raw number suggests. When morning came, it did not bring an American or Allied rescue. It brought a Japanese patrol vessel drawn to the area to recover survivors from the convoy the Tang herself had savaged 2 nights earlier. 9 sailors, including O'Kane, were picked up by a Japanese frigate the morning of October 25th, a frigate that was also carrying survivors that the ship's Tang had sunk the previous night. Survivors who had, in fact, been recovered before the Tang's own men. What followed on that frigate's deck was one of the more grimly ironic scenes of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese sailors and merchant crewmen aboard, many burned, many mutilated by the very explosions the Tang had inflicted on their ships, recognized the American prisoners for what they were, and turned on them with the accumulated fury of men who had just watched their comrades die. O'Kane later described the experience directly, offering one of the more unusually self-aware reflections to come out of any wartime memoir. When we realized that our clubbing and kickings were being administered by the burned, mutilated survivors of our handiwork, we found we could take it with less prejudice, O'Kane said later. The 9 survivors, having endured the sinking, the escape, hours of exposure in open water, and a beating at the hands of the men whose ships they had destroyed, now faced the far longer ordeal of Japanese captivity, because they had sunk vessels the Imperial Japanese Command classified, at least in part, as engaged in essential non-combatant transport. The surviving Americans were treated not as ordinary prisoners of war under the framework of the Geneva Convention, but as something closer to war criminals, a distinction that stripped away what limited protections ordinary captured servicemen might have expected. Since the Japanese regarded American submarine attacks on Japanese civilian ships a war crime, O'Kane and the 8 fellow survivors of the Tang were held as special prisoners at Ofuna prison camp near Yokosuka, Japan, which made them even more vulnerable to violent abuses than typical prisoners of war. Ofuna was not a conventional camp registered with international oversight bodies. It functioned instead as an interrogation facility run largely by Japanese naval intelligence, designed specifically to break prisoners considered to hold valuable information, submarine officers, aviators, and specialists whose knowledge of tactics, equipment, and fleet dispositions made them targets for sustained, deliberate abuse rather than simple confinement. The 9 men endured solitary confinement, beatings, and repeated interrogation sessions in which their captors probed for details about submarine tactics, torpedo performance, and fleet movements, all while denying them any of the correspondence privileges or Red Cross oversight that might have applied to ordinary captured personnel. It was, by the standards of an already brutal Pacific prisoner experience, an unusually isolating and dangerous form of captivity, one in which the outside world had no confirmed knowledge that any of the 9 men had even survived the sinking at all. For nearly a year, the Navy's official records carried the Tang as lost with all hands, her fate unconfirmed, her crew's families left in that particular. Prolonged agony of not knowing whether a husband, son, or brother was dead or simply unreachable. The truth did not begin to surface publicly until the war itself had effectively ended. Word of the Tang's true fate began to emerge on August 30th, 1945, when O'Kane spoke with Associated Press correspondent Hamilton Farron aboard the submarine Reeves in Tokyo Bay, in a story that said the Tang had been torpedoed off Formosa the previous October without getting into further detail. That was the account containing O'Kane's mind story, a version of events that, whether shaped by lingering security concerns about revealing American torpedo defects or by his own reluctance to relive the details so soon after liberation, left the true cause of the sinking hidden from public knowledge for several more days. A week later, notably after the ceremony on September 2nd that officially brought the war to an end, one of the surviving crewmen finally told the tale. When Lieutenant Lawrence Savadkin spoke to Associated Press correspondent Robert Myers in Guam on his way back home and revealed that the submarine had been sunk by her own torpedo, only then did the full uncomfortable truth reach the American public. That the deadliest submarine the Navy had ever fielded had been destroyed, not by enemy action, not by depth charge or aircraft or mine, but by a defective weapon of her own nation's manufacture, fired by her own crew. In the final minutes of an otherwise triumphant engagement, the post-war accounting of the Tang's combat record took time to settle. And even here, historians and Navy assessment boards did not entirely agree on the final numbers. A reminder that the fog of night surface actions, fought in chaos and darkness against burning, sinking, scattering targets, rarely produces figures that later analysts can confirm with total precision. The Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee, the body tasked with reviewing submarine and aircraft claims against verified Japanese losses after the war, initially credited the Tang with a more conservative total. Its tonnage was revised from the Joint Army-Navy Assessment Committee report, which initially credited Tang with fewer sinkings, 93,824 tons and 24 ships, before that section of the report was officially replaced and updated in 1980. The revised figures, drawn from a more thorough reconciliation of Japanese wartime shipping records against American patrol reports, pushed her final credited total to the number most historians cite today. Later historical analysis credited Tang with sinking 33 ships totaling 116,454 tons, placing it first among American submarines in both ships and tonnage destroyed. Whichever figure one uses, conservative or revised, the conclusion is the same. No other American submarine of the Second World War matched her lethality, and none paid a stranger or more bitterly ironic price for achieving it. For his conduct throughout the 5th Patrol, and in particular for the aggression and skill displayed during the destruction of convoy U-03 in the nights immediately preceding the sinking, Richard O'Kane was awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for battlefield valor. All 9 survived the war, and O'Kane was awarded the Medal of Honor for his success in the final war patrol. He received it not for surviving the sinking, but for what he and his crew had accomplished in the hours before it, a distinction that mattered enormously to O'Kane himself, who spent much of the remainder of his life processing the guilt of having led 87 men into a patrol from which only 8 of them would return alongside him. He would go on to write 2 detailed memoirs of his submarine service, providing historians with one of the most granular first-hand accounts of the Pacific submarine war available from any single commander. And he remained, until his death decades later, one of the most respected and most haunted figures to emerge from that theater of the war. The wreck of the Tang itself was not confirmed and precisely located until long after the war's end, resting in the shallow waters of the Taiwan Strait at a depth that, ironically, nearly matched the safe operating depth limits her Baleo-class hull had been engineered to endure. Her bow section, the same compartments that had sheltered the 13 men who attempted their desperate free ascent, remained largely intact on the seabed, a physical monument to both the resilience of her construction and the narrowness of the margin that separated survival from death that October night. Naval historians and wreck divers who have since documented her remains describe a vessel whose forward hull integrity, even in catastrophic failure, testifies to just how sound the underlying Balao-class design truly was. The flaw that killed her was never in her armor or her engineering. It was in a single defective run of an electric torpedo steering mechanism, a flaw shared by an entire generation of naval ordnance across multiple nations during the war, and one that the United States Navy would spend years after the conflict working to eliminate from torpedo designs entirely. There is a particular kind of grim mathematics that submarine historians apply when trying to measure the true cost and value of a patrol like the Tang's 5th and final run. In the space of roughly 1 month at sea, she inflicted losses on Japanese shipping that some entire submarines never matched across 10 or 15 patrols spanning years of war. In terms of ships sunk and tonnage sunk, the Tang was number 1, and some other submarines had from 10 to 15 patrols, while the Tang was number 1 with only 4 full patrols behind her before that 5th and fatal one. Each of those sunk transports represented fuel that never reached a Japanese airfield, ammunition that never reached a garrison, raw material that never reached a factory feeding the home island's collapsing war economy. American submarines as a whole, operating from bases across the Pacific against the shipping lifeline Japan could not survive without, were responsible by war's end for destroying 54 0.6% of the Japanese naval and merchant tonnage sunk by American forces, a statistic that places the entire submarine force, and the Tang's outsized contribution within it, at the center of the strategic starvation that helped bring the Japanese Empire to its knees long before the final campaigns of 1945. And yet none of that strategic mathematics answers the question that lingers over the Tang story more than any other vessel lost in that campaign. What does it mean for a machine and the men who trusted it when the very weapon designed to project their strength becomes the mechanism of their destruction? The Tullibee had already demonstrated that this particular horror was possible. The Tang demonstrated, with far greater visibility and far greater cost to a far more celebrated crew, that even the most skilled, most aggressive, most successful submarine command in the entire United States Navy remained hostage to the reliability of the ordnance loaded into her tubes. Skill, aggression, and courage had carried the Tang through 4 patrols and the overwhelming majority of a 5th, sinking more enemy tonnage than any other American submarine would ever achieve. None of it could protect her from a steering mechanism that failed at the worst conceivable moment, 20 seconds after launch, in water too shallow and too close for any evasive maneuver to matter. The 9 men who survived carried that knowledge with them for the rest of their lives. Through months of brutal interrogation at Okinawa, through liberation and the slow process of rebuilding ordinary lives after an entirely extraordinary war, through decades of reunions and memorial services and quiet conversations with historians trying to understand exactly what had happened in those final chaotic minutes before dawn on October 25th, 1944. They were, in the end, custodians of a story that the United States Navy itself did not fully release to the public until the guns had already fallen silent across the Pacific. A story too uncomfortable to tell while the war still raged. About a hero ship destroyed not by the enemy she had spent a year annihilating, but by the machinery of her own arsenal, misfiring in the last possible moment of an already legendary run. The Tang remains, in the language the submarine force still uses for its lost boats, on eternal patrol, resting in the shallow waters of a strait she once dominated more thoroughly than any other American submarine dominated any patch of ocean during the entire war. Her record stood, by tonnage and by ships sunk, at the top of the entire United States submarine force for the whole of the Second World War. A record earned in less time and fewer patrols than almost any other vessel that came close to matching it. And it stands today as one of the starkest illustrations in the entire naval history of that war of a truth. Every submariner understood, whether spoken aloud or not, that the line between the hunter and the hunted, in the enclosed, pressurized, unforgiving world beneath the surface of the sea, could sometimes be no wider than the length of a single defective torpedo, running its last quiet circle home.